Willow Creek, Montana was the kind of small town where everybody knew everybody, where the smell of morning coffee drifted through open windows, and where people measured time not by calendars, but by the familiar faces they saw every single day. And in all of Willow Creek, there was no face more familiar than the two that always appeared together, Walter Brooks and Eleanor Brooks. In 61 years, nobody had ever seen one without the other. Walter was a retired woodworker whose large, calloused hands had built half the homes in town. Every door frame, every porch beam, every rocking chair in Willow Creek carried some trace of his craftsmanship. Eleanor had spent her life as the town librarian, a gentle woman who remembered every child's favorite book without being asked. She would watch a child walk through the door and already be reaching for the right shelf before they even opened their mouth. Together, they lived at the end of Maple Street in a house that was small and simple, but full of a warmth that larger houses rarely managed to hold. There was a white porch with a wooden swing Walter had made himself during their first year of marriage. Eleanor filled the flower boxes every spring with marigolds and lavender. Behind the house was a small garden where they worked side by side every evening, Walter turning the soil while Eleanor pressed seeds into the earth. They rarely spoke during those hours. After 6 decades together, silence between them had stopped being empty. It had become its own kind of conversation. Their morning routine never changed. Walter woke at 5:30 every day and made coffee. 2 cups, one black for himself, one with milk and a spoon of honey, exactly the way Eleanor had liked it since the very first morning of their marriage. Then they would sit together on the porch swing and watch the town slowly come alive around them. Neighbors walking dogs, children running to school, shopkeepers opening their doors. Walter and Eleanor sat through it all, shoulders touching, hands sometimes finding each other without either of them thinking about it. Old age arrived the way it always does, quietly and without announcement. Walter's knees had stiffened after decades of climbing ladders and hauling lumber. Some mornings he moved slowly and needed a hand getting up from the porch swing. Eleanor's memory had begun to show small gaps. A name would disappear for a moment. A date would slip away. She once searched the entire kitchen for the kettle that was already sitting on the stove. But together, they compensated for everything. When Walter couldn't carry the grocery bags, Eleanor took them. When Eleanor forgot something, Walter remembered it for her. Without ever planning it, they had spent years quietly filling in each other's spaces. Together, they were still whole. But their children saw things differently. Their eldest son, Michael, drove down from Seattle one autumn weekend with his mind already made up. Their daughter Laura came too. They sat around the same kitchen table where the Brooks family had shared thousands of meals, and Michael placed 2 glossy brochures on the table between the coffee cups. His voice was careful, the way voices get when someone has rehearsed what they're going to say and still isn't sure how it will land. He told them they needed to talk about the future. Walter looked at the brochures without touching them. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. Michael opened the first brochure, a senior living facility in Oregon that specialized in mobility support and physical rehabilitation. The second was a memory care center in Idaho. Both were well rated. Both were highly recommended. Both were nearly 250 miles apart from each other. Eleanor read the addresses slowly. Then she looked up and asked the question as simply and quietly as if she were asking about the weather. "You want to separate us?" Laura's eyes filled immediately. She said it was for their safety. She said the house was too much to manage. She said they needed specialized care that neither of them could give each other anymore. Michael added that they had already spoken to doctors, already toured the facilities, already consulted with people who knew better than anyone what aging parents needed. He said they had thought about this for a long time. Walter was quiet for a moment. Then he said that they had taken care of each other for 60 years and he did not see why that needed to stop now. Michael shook his head gently. He said that was exactly the problem. that they had been covering for each other so well that nobody had noticed how much they had both been struggling, that it wasn't safe anymore, that love was not the same as medical care. The decision, it turned out, had already been made. The house was going to be sold. The rooms at the facilities were already reserved. The paperwork was ready. Their children had arranged everything with the certainty of people who believed, completely and genuinely, that they were doing the right thing. Walter and Eleanor did not argue. They listened. They nodded where nodding was called for. But that night, lying in the dark in the bed they had shared for over 6 decades, Eleanor reached for Walter's hand and held it without saying a word. And Walter stared at the ceiling and felt something move quietly in the back of his mind, the same feeling he always got when something was broken and needed to be fixed. The 2 weeks before they left were the longest of their lives. Moving trucks came and strangers walked through their home with boxes and labels, packing up 60 years of living as if it were just inventory. Photo albums, the dishes Eleanor had received as a wedding gift, Walter's woodworking tools, the children's old drawings that had been in a drawer since 1987. Eleanor moved through the house slowly, touching the walls of each room the way you touch the face of someone you are saying goodbye to. The kitchen where she had cooked thousands of dinners, the narrow hallway where both her children had taken their first steps, the window seat in the bedroom where she used to read on winter afternoons. Walter stood alone in his workshop after the workbench had been carried out. The room was completely empty except for a dark rectangular shadow on the floor where the bench had stood for 30 years. "I built this whole place with my own hands," he said softly. Eleanor stepped beside him and placed her hand on his arm. "I know," she said. They didn't say anything else. There was nothing else to say. The morning they left was gray and cold. 2 separate vans waited in the driveway. One would go west, one would go east. Eleanor held a small travel bag. Tucked inside it, beneath her cardigan and her reading glasses, was Walter's old red flannel shirt. She had quietly taken it from the laundry basket the night before the movers came. She had pressed it to her face in the dark, and then folded it carefully and packed it where no one would see. Walter held her hand in the driveway for a long moment. Their children stood nearby, not quite able to look at them directly. Walter looked into Eleanor's eyes. "This isn't the end," he said. She squeezed his hand once, tightly. "I know," she said. Then the vans pulled away in opposite directions, and for the first time in 61 years, Walter Brooks and Eleanor Brooks slept in different places. Walter's room at the facility overlooked a parking lot. The walls were clean and the bed was comfortable and the staff were kind. None of it mattered. His hands had nothing to do, no wood to shape, no joints to fit together, no broken thing to make whole again. He sat by the window and watched cars come and go, and felt himself becoming very still in a way that had nothing to do with rest. Eleanor's room faced a courtyard garden. There were flowers in it. She did not look at them much. She barely spoke to the other residents. The staff noted in her file that her memory seemed to be deteriorating faster than expected. But that was not what was happening. Eleanor's mind was perfectly present. She simply had nothing she wanted to say to anyone who was not Walter. Once a week, they were allowed a phone call, 15 minutes. Those 15 minutes were the only time either of them sounded like themselves. Walter's voice came alive. Eleanor laughed at something he said in the way she had laughed for 60 years, with her whole face. The staff at both facilities quietly noted that the calls seemed to help. Then one week, the call did not come. Michael had spoken to both facilities and asked them to pause the calls for a few weeks. He had read something about how contact with familiar people could sometimes slow the adjustment process. He thought he was helping. He always thought he was helping. That night, Walter did not sleep. He lay in the dark for a long time, and then he sat up, and the quiet, patient part of his mind that had built houses and fixed things and solved problems for 78 years began to move. Many years ago, on the road trip they took for their honeymoon, Walter and Eleanor had gotten lost in the mountains and found themselves standing on a ridge looking down at an abandoned cabin half hidden by pine trees. Eleanor had laughed and said it was the most romantic ruin she had ever seen. She said someday they should fix it up and grow old there, just the two of them in the mountains. Walter had smiled and said nothing, but he had remembered. A few years later, when a job took him near that area, he had looked up the land records and found that the cabin and the small parcel of land around it were available for almost nothing. He bought it quietly. Over the years, whenever work brought him within reasonable distance, he would spend a day or two there. He replaced rotting beams, he patched the roof, he rebuilt the fireplace stone by stone, he put in a small porch, he planted a garden. He told Eleanor he was on work trips. He wanted it to be a surprise. He had always imagined bringing her there on a morning when the light was just right and watching her face when she understood. He had never quite found the right moment. Now the moment had found him. It took Walter 3 days to arrange everything. He was careful and he was patient, and he had spent a lifetime solving problems that other people thought were unsolvable. On a Tuesday morning, his bed was empty, and he was gone. 3 days later, Eleanor's room was empty too. The search that followed was significant. Police checked highways, bus stations, and hospitals across 2 states. Michael and Laura drove through the night in separate directions. The facilities were questioned. Security footage was reviewed. For 2 months, Walter and Eleanor Brooks were simply gone. It was a park ranger making his autumn rounds who finally found them. He spotted smoke rising from the chimney of a cabin that was supposed to be abandoned and followed a narrow trail up through the pines. He came around a bend and stopped. 2 elderly people were sitting together on a wooden porch, holding hands, looking out at the mountains. A small vegetable garden ran along the south side of the cabin. A second rocking chair sat beside the first, and between them was a small table with 2 cups on it, one black, one with milk and honey. The cabin walls were new timber. The roof was solid. The porch boards did not creak. Firewood was stacked neatly beside the door. Inside, through the window, the ranger could see shelves with books, a warm rug on the floor, and the kind of quiet order that takes a long time to build. Eleanor looked more peaceful than she had in months. The staff at her facility had noted her decline. The park ranger saw no decline. He saw a woman sitting in the mountain air with her hand in her husband's, looking at the world with calm, clear eyes. He asked them gently if they were supposed to be there. Walter smiled the way he always smiled, slowly and from somewhere deep. "Yes," he said, "we finally came home." When Michael and Laura arrived, they had prepared themselves for a difficult conversation. They had rehearsed explanations and apologies and arguments. What they found instead stopped all of it before it could begin. Their parents looked well. Not just physically well, but the kind of well that has nothing to do with medical charts. They were themselves again. Eleanor began to cry before she even reached the porch. Eleanor rose slowly and took her daughter's face in both hands. "You were trying," Eleanor said softly. "I know you were trying." She looked over at Walter, who was watching her the way he had watched her for 61 years, as if she were the most interesting thing he had ever seen in his life. "But love isn't something you can organize on paper," Eleanor said. "For some people, the best medicine in the world isn't a facility or a program or a specialist." She paused. "It's just the person who has been beside you your whole life, still beside you." Nobody said anything for a long time. The mountains were very quiet. Somewhere below in the trees a bird called once and then went still. Walter reached over and picked up Eleanor's cup from the small table. He handed it to her without looking, the way you hand something to someone when you have done it 10,000 times and your hands simply know. Milk and honey. Exactly right. She took it and held it in both hands and looked out at the mountains. And that was enough. That had always been enough. Growing old should never mean growing alone. There are people who have spent their entire lives building something, a home, a family, a love that has weathered every season. When they reach the end of the road, what they need most is not always what looks best on a brochure. Sometimes the greatest safety in the world is not a facility with good ratings and qualified staff. Sometimes it is simply the hand you have held for a lifetime, still warm, still there, still holding yours.